What do you think about when you hear that word? For me, I think about me and my 4 brothers and sisters in our wild and crazy house that we grew up in. We were known to have conversations or arguments until like 3 o'clock in the morning. We all had our own very specific opinions that often were at odds with each other. I also remember my parents kind of being in the middle of that as well, jumping in and out of our conversations that sometimes turned into arguments. That's what I think about when I think about family. Now here's the deal. On the spectrum of awesome to awful, rarely does family fall anywhere in the middle. Often it falls on one extreme or the other. And most of us know that things can easily turn from awesome to awful relatively quickly at the drop of a hat. Not only are our feelings of family unique, but also our families are relatively unique. We all have very different types of families. We all have very different types of backgrounds. Maybe you came from a family that had more rules than other families. Maybe you came from a family that was a little bit more relaxed or chill. Either way, we all have a very unique family that we've come from. Because the thing is, no family is exactly the same. Every single family comes with its own unique needs and preferences and cultures and traditions that make it special. Sometimes these differences can be a recipe for disaster. And I'm sure many of us have seen situations in which disaster could strike relatively quickly. When tensions come up, people tend to start acting in a way that they think that they're supposed to act, as opposed to how they should be acting in that situation. And furthermore, faith adds a whole other level of complication to this, because some of us don't grow up in families that have faith, and that means that we can't turn to God when our family is going through a rough time or there's tensions that we can't seem to fix or to solve. For some of us, it feels like faith is one thing and family is something completely different. So in John 13:1, we see Jesus spending time with the disciples. Now by this point, Jesus had been hanging out with these guys for years, so they were basically like his own family. And in John 13, we see Jesus having one final meal with them before he's arrested. I'm going to read the first couple of verses to you. John 13:1 says, "Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus." So we're walking in on a scene where Jesus is spending time with his disciples, and already one of them has been prompted by the devil to betray him. Now it's super interesting to see what Jesus decides to do next. Now remember, Jesus was somebody who had a lot of authority and a lot of power over the people he was around. After all, he was the Son of God. But ultimately, he decides to do something that most people with his stature would have never decided to do. Let's read the next few verses. "So he got up from the table and took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around them." So even though Jesus was the Son of God, and even though Jesus was considered the authority figure to all the disciples, he still decides to humble himself and to wash their feet. Now, Jesus goes on to tell the disciples that, first of all, one of them would outright betray him, and he told Peter that Peter would deny him in front of others. This was something that was considered a big shock to the people around him. And Jesus ends by giving them one more commandment. He says in verse 34, "So now I am giving you a new commandment, love each other, just as I have loved you, and you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." So after all of this, his ultimate commandment to these guys that he had been spending so much time with, these guys that basically felt like his family, were to love. Why would he tell them to love? Because ultimately love is what matters the most. And love also matters the most in your families as well. Now, what does it look like to love in really complicated family situations? We actually see Paul talk about what this looks like in the book of 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7, this is what Paul has to say. He says, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. If you want your faith to help your family, ultimately you need to love as much as you can. Because that's the one thing that you have control over, how much you love. And ultimately is the most important thing for you and your family. So in that passage in 1 Corinthians that we just looked at, we looked at a bunch of different applications of love. We looked at how love is patient, how it's long-suffering, how it's kind. I want you to go back to that passage and I want you to think about which one of those applications of love do you need to work on this week? And even go a step further and think which one of these applications of love do you need to work on in regards to your family? And if possible, think of even a specific family member that you can love better this week. But like I said, don't just keep it really vague and big and just say that you're gonna love them more. Talk about how you're going to love them more. Talk about how it's going to be evident to them that you love them this week. Now, I know this all sounds like stuff that's really nice to hear, but it's a lot more difficult to practice in the real world when things get rough at home. That's why we have small groups, so we can process these things together, so we can walk through some of the difficult things that happen in our house or in our family with other people who love and care about us and can pray with us and for us about them. So I hope throughout the course of this whole series, you can remember that when it comes to your faith, your family matters. And when it comes to your family, love is what matters the most.